Hey everyone, it's Dylan with SeaTee Aquatics, and this is the complete guide to saltwater aquarium ecosystems. This video is a compilation of all of the videos that I've made that involve aquarium ecosystems, put together in a fashion to help you understand how you can maintain the ecosystem in your own aquarium right at home. Hope you enjoy the video. Talked about in previous videos, nitrate and phosphates are both nutrients that are essential in our reef tanks. They are key nutrients that coral use for energy, coloration, and growth. So having nitrates and phosphates in your system are super important, but you can also have levels that are too high. Having levels that are too high can be detrimental to your system for a number of reasons. In today's video, I'm going to go through what I think are ideal numbers for nitrates and phosphates, how the numbers can affect your system, and how you can manipulate these numbers. Hope you enjoy the video. So it's important to understand what role each of these elements plays in our tank and how they enter the tank. Both nitrates and phosphates tend to enter our system through feeding. We've talked about the nitrogen cycle, where food breaks down into ammonia, and then the beneficial bacteria in our system will break the ammonia down into nitrite and further into nitrate. That is how most of the nitrate is going to enter our system. As for phosphate, most of this comes from feeding as well. Although the phosphate does not have to go through a process, because as the food breaks down, it will simply leach the phosphates into the water, as they are already present in the food. There's a lot of talk about a specific ratio to keep your nitrates and phosphates. This can be called an NPK ratio, N being nitrate, P being phosphate, and K being potassium, a less talked about element in reefing. From my experience, having a specific ratio is less important as it is to try and maintain numbers within a specific range. The range being about 5 parts per million to 30 parts per million for nitrate, and 0.03 to 0.05 parts per million for phosphate. Maintaining the range is important because, one, your coral thrive on consistency. Staying within a tight range helps to keep your tank more consistent, keeping your corals happier. For nitrate, there is quite a large range. Typically, I like to pick a number within that range and try to stick to it as close as possible. Every tank will be different, but typically, having higher nitrates will result in more coral coloration, but can also fuel nuisance algae growth, as algae is also going to be growing using the excess nitrates and phosphates in the system. Now, although both of these elements are super important, I believe that phosphates is a much more crucial element, and because of the tight range that you need to keep it in, it is that much more important to test it often. As stated before, I like to keep my phosphates between 0.03 and 0.05 parts per million. Going below the 0.03 mark for phosphates in your tank can cause certain opportunistic bacteria, such as dinoflagellates, to take over in your tank. Dinoflagellates look like a type of brown algae, but they are actually a bacteria that take over when the opportunity arises. Typically, when there's a lack of algae present. The lack of algae comes from a lack of phosphates. Versus if you go to the other end, going above 0.05 may be okay, but going above 0.1 parts per million phosphate can start to become detrimental, as one, the increased phosphate levels will increase brown colorations in our coral, which tend to be undesirable, and going above 0.15 parts per million phosphate typically stops the calcification of coral, meaning the coral is not going to grow anymore. This is why it's super important to keep your phosphate levels in a tight range. Again, phosphate levels increasing can also increase nuisance algae growth. So if you start to notice a lot of nuisance algae growing in your tank, check your phosphate levels. Now, it is important to note that if you are getting nuisance algae growth and you're testing your nitrate and phosphate levels and they are reading low, it doesn't mean that you have a lack of nitrates and phosphates in the system. What it typically means, from my experience, is that the nuisance algae is absorbing enough of the nitrates and phosphates that are excess to keep the levels low, but it's also fueling their own growth, meaning you're going to see a lot of nuisance algae continue to grow. So, if you're testing nitrates and phosphates and they seem low, but your algae continues to grow and blow up in your system, I would recommend adding some sort of phosphate or nitrate remover to the tank, or decrease feeding in order to reduce the nitrates and phosphates going into your system. Now, it will take time for this nuisance algae to go away, but I found that the most effective way to get rid of it over time is to simply reduce nitrate and phosphate input, or to have more nitrate and phosphate exported out of the system through absorbent materials or water changes. With that being said, I think the relationship between nitrates and phosphate specifically is less important than maintaining the values as much as possible. Again, sticking to a number for nitrate is super important, but the range that your fish and coral can handle is much larger than that range for phosphate. Whereas for phosphate, you should check it regularly, keep it in that tighter range, and that will help to maintain good coral growth and coloration. So in my previous videos, we've also talked about how to test nitrates and phosphates. But how would you increase them or decrease them when needed? Personally, for increasing nitrates and phosphates together, I like to simply just add more food to the tank. The fish are happier, the coral are happier, and you accomplish the goal of increasing both nitrates and phosphates. In a situation where you need to increase just one or the other, I would recommend an additive such as from Brightwell or from Nios, in which you can mathematically increase your nitrate or phosphate based on a specific dosage. You use your system's volume and the desired increase in nitrate or phosphate with the calculation written on the bottle to give you the dosage for the tank. As stated, there's a few brands that have options, and all of them I've tested and they all work great. As far as decreasing nitrates and phosphates, again, the simplest option for decreasing them is going to be to reduce feeding and to increase water changes. Both of these options are great in reducing both nitrates and phosphates. If you are trying to reduce one or the other, the best option is going to be absorbent materials. Something like GFO, granular ferric oxide, is great at removing phosphates from the system. Typically, it's going to be more important to reduce the phosphates, so because of that, there are a lot more phosphate absorbent materials on the market and many different brands of GFO. As far as nitrates go, the best product that I have found as an absorbent material is going to be dinitrate from SeaTee. This is a biological ceramic media that has some sort of additional absorbent material within it that helps to reduce nitrates. This absorbent is nice because you can leave it in the tank long term, and as the nitrate absorbing effects wear off, it will leave the ceramic media behind, which will act as a biological media for the tank, which will help to break down ammonia, nitrite, and potentially nitrate if it's able to grow anaerobic bacteria within. Personally, for reducing nitrates, I think the best option is to just maintain regular water changes and then maintain your phosphate levels with either GFO or phosphate additives when needed. So what is the ideal temperature range in a reef tank? Ideally, the temperature is going to be anywhere between 76 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit, as this is the temperature range that the corals are most adapted to in the wild. Coral and fish tend to live in tropical zones, and the water tends to stay at least above 75 degrees. Now, in nature, obviously, temperature is going to fluctuate quite a bit, regardless of where you are. But in the tropical areas, it doesn't typically get too much below 70 degrees. In our fish tanks, we want to keep the numbers as stable as possible in order to help promote less stress, better coloration, and more growth. In my opinion, it is best to keep the temperature range as tight as possible, having the smallest degree swing you can. Most heaters that we buy from the fish store will have a 2-degree swing, meaning that if you set your temperature to 78 degrees, you should expect to see temperatures anywhere from 77 to 79 degrees. It can go up or down 1 degree from the set point. This is a pretty typical swing and is more than fair for any fish tanks. If you're able to maintain that swing at a lower amount using a controller such as the Hydros or Apex, you can do so by setting your temperature range and using a temperature probe. In most of my tanks are set to 78 degrees plus or minus 0.25 for a grand total of a ½ degree swing, meaning that my tanks are almost dead set right at 78 degrees all the time. Keeping the temperature stable, just as we keep any of the other elements stable, will help to reduce coral stress, promote growth and coloration. So what happens if our tank gets too hot? Well, in some areas of the country or the world, using a heater may not be the best option, as the temperatures in your area are already past that 78 mark, sometimes well into the 80s, and the fish tank can suffer when this happens. In that case, instead of adding a heater to the tank, you would want to add a chiller. Again, the goal is to maintain the temperature as close to 78 as possible. So what happens if the temperature gets too high? Well, heat stress can be very detrimental, especially to coral. Any hard coral can die very rapidly if exposed to too much heat. When temperatures get too high, the first thing you'll tend to notice is bleaching, which means that the coral's color will start to decrease. It will start to white out. If the temperatures increase too high too quickly, or the swing is too large, it can cause all of the coral to rapidly bleach and even experience tissue necrosis, which is when the coral just pretty much strips all of its zoas and belly into the water and leaves behind a bleached white skeleton. And what happens if the temperature gets too cold? Typically it's very similar, except the stress may be prolonged. You may not see the rapid discoloration as you would with super high heat, but typically cold is also going to stress out the organisms, affect their metabolism, and can eventually result in death. With that being said, I find that it is super important to keep an eye on temperature regularly. Check to make sure your heaters or chillers are always functioning properly, and to make sure that you have an accurate temperature gauge reading out a temperature at all times. If you're lucky enough to have a controller, I also highly recommend setting up an alarm if the temperature is to go out of the range.
What is nutrition in our reef tanks? Nutrition is a combination of both food, elements, and additives that both our coral and fish need to survive. Fish food counts as nutrition going into the tank. Once the fish food has started breaking down into nitrates and phosphates, these are the nutrients that our coral tend to uptake, as well as algae. With all of that being said, nutrition is super important within our tanks. Everything that we put into our tanks has a direct impact on the tank. The amount of food that we put into the tank will directly impact the level of nutrients in our tanks. Overfeeding generally will cause nitrates and phosphates to increase. Having a nitrate and phosphate increase in the tanks can cause algae blooms, but it's also important to note that you need these nutrients in your tank, as again, they feed both our fish and our coral. There are different types of food that we put into our tank to feed both our fish and coral, and each of these foods are going to have different nutrient and nutrition levels. Something like a pellet food is going to be nutrient dense, meaning each pellet has a high level of nutrition for the fish, as well as it will break down into higher levels of nitrate and phosphate as compared to something like frozen food, which tends to be less nutrient dense, putting less of these elements into our water. Something like a powdered coral food tends to be the most highly packed with nitrates and phosphates, so I'd recommend feeding these only when necessary. On the other hand, it's important to feed your fish regularly, as every fish has a different metabolism. It is important to know what kinds of fish you have and what the requirements for each fish is. If it's something like a tang, more algae-based food is going to be better, and feeding large pellets once or twice a day should be sufficient. On the other hand, if you have fish like Amphius, you'll need to feed smaller pellets, typically omnivore pellets, as much as 5 times a day, as they have a super fast metabolism and need to keep eating in order to keep their energy levels up. After the food has been processed by the fish, or simply broken down by the beneficial bacteria in our tank, it comes out in the forms of nitrates and phosphates. As talked about in previous videos, nitrates and phosphates are a feeding source for both coral and algae, meaning that they are key nutrients in the growth of both of those. With that being said, maintaining the proper levels of nitrates and phosphates becomes super critical. Nitrate and phosphate levels can be managed simply by altering your feeding. It's also important to note that it is highly recommended to feed a variety of food to your fish. It's not great to just stick to one pellet. In my opinion, it is much better to feed a variety. Maybe one day you'll do pellets, another day you do frozen food. Personally, I like to keep pellets on an auto feeder, as these are the most nutrient dense feedings. I can control exactly how much gets put into the tank at each feeding in set increments. This way you know exactly over time how much nitrate and phosphate is being added to the system by that. And then I like to supplement frozen feedings in order to give the extra nutrition to my fish. I tend to feed frozen food a little heavier if I notice that the nitrate and phosphate uptake has increased, or if coral growth has increased. And if I start to notice a lot of algae, it will decrease the frozen feedings. But as stated before, I keep the pellet food in the auto feeder to keep that as consistent as possible. Furthermore, knowing how much food goes into the system makes it much more predictable and allows for a consistent balance with water changes. Over time, you should see exactly how much your nitrate and phosphates go up during a given week, and then with each water change, you should see how much they go down. At that point, you can control your water changes to help maintain a better balance, or you can control feedings if you are having high levels. With that being said, Monitoring your nitrates and phosphates is super important, and controlling them with food going in and water changes being nutrients coming out of the tank is super important.
Filtration is one of the most important things to talk about when discussing saltwater aquariums. In today's video, I'm going to explain the different types of filtration and how they can be applied to your fish tanks at home. The first and most important type of filtration, in my opinion, is biological filtration. Now, to some extent, we have talked about biological filtration in the past when talking about the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is the #1 source of the biological filtration happening in our reef tanks. Beneficial bacteria gets added to our tank on startup, and this beneficial bacteria grows and populates the surfaces of our tank to help break down waste and waste products from the fish in the tank. These waste products are ammonia, which is then broken down into nitrite and further into nitrate. Another waste product that we tend to measure in our tanks is phosphates. Phosphates tend to not be managed so much through biological filtration, but more so through the next option, which is mechanical filtration. Mechanical filtration is any sort of physical object added to the tank to help clean our tanks. Typically, the most common form of mechanical filtration is going to be either filter socks or a fleece roller. Both of these options get placed into the first chamber of our sump and sometimes even into the back of the aquarium. These mechanical filters allow water to pass through, but small particulates and even larger ones to get trapped within the sock or fleece. Over time, the socks or fleece will become clogged with all of the detritus and free-floating stuff that has been removed from the water and will start to clog up. The socks or fleece can then be removed from the tank in order to remove this from the tank and prevent it from breaking down. Typically, filter socks should be replaced every 3 days, as any of the detritus and material that the filter's socks may have caught will start to break down after 2 to 3 days, and as they break down, they will start to leach nitrates and phosphates back into the water. The filter socks are going to catch everything from small particulate matter to uneaten food, fish poop, and anything in between. That is why mechanical filtration is so important. It tends to polish the water by removing these fine particles. It is super important to make sure that you remove your filter socks on a regular basis and either clean or replace them, as the detritus and food that the filter socks is catching will start to break down within 2 to 3 days, and as it breaks down, it will leach nitrates and phosphates into the water, which we're trying to reduce. Another example of mechanical filtration is something like a protein skimmer. We've not really touched on protein skimmers too much in this series, but it is something that we will go into in the future. A protein skimmer uses mechanical functions in order to remove proteins from the tank. What this means is water and air are mixed together to form foam. In a saltwater tank, this foam gets created due to the small air bubbles getting trapped. These air bubbles will naturally attach to proteins in the water, and then as the bubbles raise to the top and pop, they bring the proteins to the surface with them. As time goes on, these proteins will build up at the top layer and start to travel up the neck of the protein skimmer, in which they can then be collected into the collection cup. These proteins generally break down further into nitrates and phosphates, so using a protein skimmer is another great option to help remove nitrate and phosphates from building up in the system. So now that we have established good biological filtration to help break down the ammonia into nitrites and nitrates, and we have good mechanical filtration to help remove particulates and anything breaking down from the water, the final type of filtration to look at is chemical filtration. Personally, I like to look at chemical filtration last, as I typically find that there are better non-chemical methods to help clean the water before going to something like this, as chemical filtration options can be more stressful to the system, they can be less natural. But not all chemical filtration is unnatural, such as activated carbon or granular ferric oxide. Both of these are somewhat natural in the sense that carbon and GFO naturally occur in nature. They act as absorbents to remove undesirables from the water. If we look at activated carbon, this is something that I like to use from time to time for a few different reasons. The first reason is to help clear up the water. Typically, over time, organics will build up in the system, even if you're doing water changes, and this can cause a yellowing of the water. Using activated carbon, this can remove the organics that cause the yellowing and create crystal clear water to make your tank that much nicer to look at. Another reason to use carbon is to help remove any undesirable smells. If you have any smells coming from your fish tank, carbon can help to reduce these. The third and most important reason for using carbon, in my opinion, is to remove medications from the tank. Lots of times, especially in quarantine, we will medicate the tank with the fish in order to help remove diseases and parasites. Some of these medications can be added directly into our reef tanks. Regardless of where they're added, activated carbon is a great option for removing these medications from the water, whether it's from a quarantine tank or your main display tank. Another example of chemical media is something like granular ferric oxide, or GFO. GFO, it is oxidized iron, or granular ferric meaning iron, and oxide meaning oxidized. It's essentially rust, or clumps of rust. This GFO acts as an absorbent for phosphates, making it super beneficial for our tanks if phosphates is a battle for you. Personally, I use GFO on 1 or 2 tanks here, but not all of them, as most of the tanks have such a heavy coral stock that my phosphates are on the lower side because the coral is absorbing most of them. With that being said, there are many other options for chemical filtration, although, as I've stated, I tend to stay away from these unless absolutely required. So why is lighting so important in our reef tanks? Simply put, lighting is so important because coral is photosynthetic. What that means is coral requires light to survive. Now, if you don't have any coral in your tank or don't plan to have coral, you don't need to have any special light. Actually, you don't need to have any light at all. In that case, the light would be more so that you can see your fish and other inhabitants. But in our case, we do plan to grow coral, and therefore, the lighting is super important. As mentioned in previous videos, coral has a symbiotic relationship with a type of algae called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae is a photosynthetic organism, meaning that it absorbs light to help make energy. With that being said, the light that we choose for our tank is super important in helping to maintain happy and healthy coral. There are 4 key factors to look at when deciding on the lighting for your reef tank. Those 4 factors are the spectrum, the intensity, the coverage, and your lighting schedule. So let's start with color spectrum. Coral mostly use blue and violet light spectrums, especially when you're trying to get more glow or highlighter type colors in your coral. Having a lot of blues is super important in maintaining coral health, mostly because it helps with color. But coral also uses more than just blue, so it is essential to have a mix of multiple different colors of LEDs. So it is important to have a good spectrum, not just blue and violet, but also to have small amounts of green, red, yellow, and white. Personally, I like when my tanks have more of a white look to them rather than being super blue all the time. But I do also like the way that coral looks under the blue glow. So personally, I have my tanks spectrum-wise go blue at both sunrise and sunset, and then during the peak intensity of the day, I increase the whites so that I get both spectrums and both color looks. But again, blue is always going to be your main color within the spectrum, regardless of whether you want it to look more white or more blue. There are many lights on the market that come with presets that allow you to choose a spectrum that is already suited for coral growth, some which are more blue, some which are more white, and some that do what I just mentioned I do for my tank, where you get a mix. It may be more blue in the morning, more white in the evening. You may get blue at sunrise and sunset, and white in the middle of the day, or vice versa. There are also lights like Kessel, where rather than dialing in each individual LED to get different spectrums, it is pre-tuned so that you can just turn a knob. That knob will go from a warmer white to an almost blue, and no matter where you set the knob, it will be in an effective range for your coral. The next important topic to talk about is light intensity. Intensity is important because if you don't have enough intensity or enough PAR, then your coral won't have enough light and they'll struggle to thrive. But on the other side, if you have light that's way too intense, you can easily burn out and kill your coral in a very short period of time. That is why getting the right intensity is so important. With different types of coral, they require different levels of light. Typically, but not always, soft coral require lower PARs, anywhere up to 75 PAR. LPS coral typically thrive in areas of 75 to 150 PAR, and SPS coral will typically thrive in 150 PAR and plus. So knowing your coral and knowing the light intensity is super important. That is where a device such as a PAR meter comes in handy. You can easily rent a PAR meter from a place like Bulk Reef Supply, or even your local fish store may have them. I know mine does. For a relatively low price, you can test all of your tanks once you have your lights set up, set the par, map out the areas of your tank, and write it down where the par is so that you know where to place your coral in the future. And then you can return the par meter either to Bulk Reef or your local fish store, wherever you may have rented it from, and it will save you from having to spend $500 or $600 on buying and owning a par meter. The third most important thing to talk about when it comes to lighting is coverage. This kind of goes back to the par meter map, but when you're doing this, and even if you're not doing this, typically, the center of your tank is going to form more of a hot spot under the light than the edges. This is because most lights are kind of like a spotlight. Directly under the light is going to be the most intense light. And then as you spread out, the light gets dimmer. You can see this on a par meter. As you would notice, directly under the light, the numbers are higher. And then as you go closer to the edges of your tank, those numbers will decrease. This is why coverage is so important. Depending on the size of your tank and what light you get, the light may not have the coverage that you need. The edges of your tank may not get enough light to support coral, and therefore you would either need to supplement more light or keep the coral out of those areas of the tank. In my opinion, you can always add more lights, so it's never a bad idea to start with something on the cheaper end, as long as you know that it will be sufficient for at least part of your tank. Personally, I like the AI primes for this reason, because each AI prime puck has 16 LEDs in it, it has a good spectrum, and depending on the type of coral you get, can cover a 2 foot by 2 foot area. But if you want to increase the intensity or go to a bigger tank, for example, all you have to do is buy a few more lights. If you compare these lights to their counterparts, such as the Hydra 32 or the Hydra 64, which is essentially multiple AI primes combined, the pricing is very comparable. So it makes it worth it, especially if you're on a tight budget, to start with those, as again, they're smaller lights, and as you upgrade your tank, you can always upgrade the lights. The final thing to consider when choosing and setting up lights is the lighting schedule. It's important to note that coral typically don't need more than 12 hours of light per day. And honestly, that's on the high side. The minimum that I would recommend is about 8 hours. So anywhere from 8 to 12 hours is going to be acceptable. In display areas, I typically run the tank lighting schedule to the schedule of which the tank will be viewed. What that means is, for example, in an office building that's open 8 to 5, I'll have the lights run from 8 to 5. That's a 9-hour period, which is more than enough. Now, I would not recommend running at peak intensity during that entire 8 to 12 hours, especially if you're running on the higher side, closer to 12 hours. What that means is if your lights have any options for ramp up or ramp down times, I would highly recommend keeping the lights dimmer in the morning and at night, having a point in the middle of the day where you reach peak intensity, and then coming back down. The reason for this is if you run at peak intensity all day long, you're going to more likely than not err on the side of danger, and you could potentially burn out the coral just like you would if the light was too intense. So if you cannot adjust the intensity of the light, I would definitely recommend to go on the shorter time period and to try and keep the light a little bit further away from the tank to keep the intensity down. But in most cases, modern LEDs all come with the ability to ramp up and ramp down. So usually, most people will have that option. As I stated before, I like to keep my lights blue during sunrise and sunset, and then during the peak intensity, I tend to go with more white. So what that looks like is in the morning, the blue lights will come on, they ramp up to about 50% intensity, they stay there for a little while, then in the middle of the day, the lights will ramp up further with white, reaching the 100% intensity, which I don't think my light actually hits 100%, but it reaches 100% for my schedule at least. It runs at that for about 4 hours. Then it drops back down to the 50% intensity, running blue, and then finally will come off. When setting up a new light, I would personally recommend using any of the preset schedules that may be included in your lighting's program. The reason for this is trying to adjust each LED individually, which most companies will allow for on their lights at this point, ends up being more of a disaster than a problem solver. At this point in time, most lights that people would be investing in are going to be LEDs. And that is why this whole video I talked about LEDs. In the past, a lot of people have relied on T5 fluorescent lighting or metal halide. Both have their pros and cons, But at the end of the day, technology has favored the LEDs. They're much cheaper to produce, easier to maintain, and cause far fewer issues with the fish tanks. With that being said, I've only ever used LEDs for my tanks, so I'm not going to speak on the other options. So why is flow so important in our fish tanks? The number one main reason why flow is so important in our fish tanks is gas exchange. Gas exchange is the process of exchanging CO2 that is building up in the water that is respirated by the fish and coral into the air in exchange for oxygen that the fish and coral can then use to breathe, and the process repeats. Flow is crucial to this process because it creates water movement, and the water movement is what releases the gases into the atmosphere and allows the water to absorb fresh oxygen. This makes flow super important for both fish and coral health, meaning that this is required regardless of what kind of tank you're keeping, so long as you plan to keep anything living. Now, if you're doing a fish-only system, you can get away with lower flow so long as you have enough for the fish to be able to swim through something and for there to be at least some surface movement for the gas exchange to occur. Other than that, the rest of the flow in the tank will mostly be determined by the types of coral that you keep in the system. With that being said, there are other reasons why flow is so important to our reef tanks. The first being nutrient absorption. What this means is that without flow, any of the additives that we add into our tank aren't going to get stirred into the water, and therefore they'll never reach the coral, meaning the coral will never be able to absorb any of it and use it for its growth. The second main reason that flow is important is for waste removal. Detritus is going to naturally build up in the tank over time, and having higher flow will help to keep this stirred up into the water column so that it can be removed by mechanical filtration. If you end up with large areas of detritus building up in the tank, it may be a sign that you need to adjust your power heads or even add more. If you feel like you have sufficient flow and you're still ending up with a pocket of detritus in maybe a hard to reach area, I would just recommend removing the detritus with a siphon during weekly water changes. So now that you know why flow is so important, let's talk about how to optimize it. Personally, I think having a turnover rate of at least 10 times per hour is super important, but I've heard of people recommending up to even 100 times per hour, depending on the type of coral. What turnover rate means is that if your tank is, let's say, 100 gallons, then you would have, if it's a 10 times turnover rate, 1,000 gallons per hour of flow. And that's how you would determine which power heads you would buy. Typically, I would only recommend a 10 times turnover rate on a tank that has maybe LPS or soft coral, as they do not require super high flow. But for tanks that have coral like SPS, I would recommend up to even 50 times per hour, meaning that if your tank is 100 gallons, you have up to 5,000 gallons per hour of flow. Determining this early on and determining what types of coral you're going to keep is important so that you know which power heads are going to be effective in your system. I would also recommend using multiple power heads, as having one source of flow can cause a lot more dead spots in the tank. Having multiple power heads can cause better water movement and can cause detritus to get stirred up much better. Having the power heads on opposing sides of the tank facing right at each other can also help to generate a more random flow pattern in the tank, which has been proven to be healthier for coral and in general tends to help remove detritus just a little bit better than a standard direct flow pattern. Remember, the main goal with the flow is to eliminate as many dead spots as possible. So even if you have a lower flow rate, you still want to adjust your power heads in a way to help prevent detritus from building up in different areas of the tank. As mentioned, different coral require different amounts of flow in the system, but it's also important to note that coral require different types of flow. SPS, which likes higher flow rates, also tends to like more direct flow, whereas LPS and soft coral tends to like more indirect flow, meaning that there's water moving around them, but the power head isn't shooting water directly at them. Versus direct flow, you can put the coral pretty much directly in front of the power head. Finally, it's important to note that you may need to adjust your power heads and flow over time as your coral grows, especially hard coral, as it may grow in front of the power head, blocking it and cutting off flow to different areas of the tank. In this case, it may even be necessary to add additional power heads.
So there you go. In today's video, we've gone through all of the different elements that make up an aquarium ecosystem and how you can maintain these in your own tank at home. Hope you enjoyed what you saw, and remember, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications to join us on our journey through the sea. Or drop a comment below and let us know what you thought of the video. Thanks for watching.